Good afternoon, and welcome to the Roundtable 4, this is the afternoon session that will be moderated by Mr. Paul Whittingham, who heads the Migration and Modern Slavery Department of the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office of UK. Mr. Whittingham has previously worked as head of DFID in Yemen and Burma offices, as well as deputy country director in Bangladesh, and as a governance program manager in Tanzania. He has held key policy roles in DFID on China, finance, trade. With these few introductory words about our chair for this afternoon session, I'll pass the floor. As in for previous sessions, my colleague Julian and I are here to support you as technical moderators, and the process remains the same. Those that will wish to request to speak once the floor is open will have to request, and we will give them access to. Mr. Whittingham, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Elisa, and I hope everyone can hear me. It's a great pleasure to be here today, even virtually. I think all of us would much rather be here in person, but I guess we got used to working in this way over the last few months in these strange conditions we find ourselves in. So here I am broadcasting from my house in London to you all. It is a great pleasure to be here, and a great and thank you, IOM, for organising these regional review roundtables. And certainly thank you also for the opportunity you've given us to moderate this panel on behalf of the UK. I think of all the roundtables that have taken place so far, this may be the broadest one, or certainly covers the broadest range of topics, covering as it does data and evidence, migrant vulnerability, access to information, and how we sustain global and regional partnerships. So clearly, I'm expecting and looking forward to a wide-ranging discussion. We have an excellent panel who will start our discussions, and then we will take interventions from the floor. So I think we've got a really broad range of perspectives and stakeholders. And I'm sure you will all have seen as well the paper that accompanies this session, and in which there are some guiding questions. Part of my role, my main role, I think, as moderator is to introduce the panelists. IOM colleagues are going to do all the hard work in terms of trying to manage this session as smoothly as possible with the IT. But I do have to remind you just of a few things, some housekeeping things about how we manage this session. Could I ask, please, panelists and those wishing to speak from the floor, firstly, to stick to the specific objectives covered by the roundtable. Also, if you wish to speak or respond to panelists' comments and interventions, please do that via the chat box. If you could, panelists, please click the blue request to speak button, and that way you'll be given access to the floor. And I think panelists, once you've made your contributions, you'll remain on the panel as speakers. And could I ask everyone, and I'll try and adhere to this myself, when not speaking, to mute microphones, so we keep the sound quality as high as possible. I'm not going to say too much more, but I would just say on behalf of the UK that we, as the UK, are a country of immigration. We are in the top 10 country for immigrants per capita, and we also have one of the largest diasporas around the world. But many of our citizens don't really understand the scale and the contribution that migration makes to our economy and to our lives. And so it's absolutely essential that data and evidence is promoted, the quality is improved, and that then informs a debate and good policy making. So that's really what this session, I think, is about. We're very clear in our new organisation, the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, that Britain continues to be and wants to be, aspires to be, a force for good in the world, promoting values, and be a champion of international cooperation. And that's why our support for the Global Compact remains as strong as ever. Migration is an area where the international and the domestic overlap very, very importantly. But most of all, it's about human beings. It's about how we protect the most vulnerable, and about how we partner with those who want to make a contribution and seek better lives for themselves and societies. So I'm really looking forward to this session, which brings together good data, quality of evidence into policy making, and make sure that we have a good and rational debate about it. So thank you. I'm going to introduce now the speaker, our first panel speaker, who is, forgive me, I'll just pull up the relevant documents, Ms. Britta Behrendt, who is the Director for General Issues of Migration and Refugee Policy and EU Freedom of Movement in the German Federal Ministry of the Interior. Britta, and there is another speaker as well, Ms. Hani Dahimi from the Federal Chancellery. Britta has been the head of the Division for General Migration Policy, the Federal Ministry, since autumn of 2018. And prior to that, she was a liaison officer at the Italian Interior Ministry in Rome. She joined the Federal Ministry of the Interior in 2008, having previously worked at the German Bundestag for 4 years. And whilst at the Federal Ministry, she worked on interior, building and community policy affairs, as well as being a speechwriter for the then Minister, Thomas de Maizière, and later Ursula von der Leyen. So, Britta, I hope that introduction does you justice, and I hand over to you and look forward to hearing from you. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Elisa, as well. Very warm welcome on behalf of the German presidency. As Roundtable 4 offers such a broad variety of objectives, my colleague Hani Dahimi from the Federal Chancellery and we decided to concentrate on some objectives and to share our speaking time. So I will focus mainly on the data part, which means on objectives 1 and 3. My dear colleague Hani Dahimi will focus on objective 17. So without further ado, let's get started. When it comes to migration data, I could talk for hours, but today I was told to be brief, and therefore I will focus on some aspects. Enhancing migration data is top priority for the German government. That's why we, as Germany, support the MPTF quite substantially. And that is actually why we are really proud and honored that the Global Migration Data Analysis Center, the GMDAC, was established in Berlin on invitation of the German government. Achieving better international migration data and analysis is our shared goal, and GMDAC is a real, reliable and strong partner. Supporting the work of the GMDAC has proved to be very fruitful, and due to time restriction, I will only mention some of the highlights. I would like to start with the second International Forum on Migration Statistics, the IFMS, which Germany supported and which took place in Cairo in January 2020. The 2020 IFMS was the largest gathering focusing on migration data and statistics ever, with more than 700 participants from all over the world. It was hosted by the Egyptian government under the auspices of the African Union and co-organized by IOM, UNDESA and the OECD. I myself had the honor to be on the opening panel, and I can only support the UN Secretary General, who explicitly points out that the IFMS contributed to the promotion of evidence-based and data-driven discourse, policy and planning, which is obviously in line with Objective 1. For me personally, it was a real eye-opener. And I'm already looking forward to the next IFMS, which I think due to COVID-19 will take place in 2022. Another important milestone in supporting Objective 1 and 3 was the creation of the Global Migration Data Portal, supported by Switzerland, Germany, and IOM, obviously, which this portal offers migration data in 4 languages, including regional overviews, an overview of existing migration profiles, and data and new data innovation directory on big data and other innovations. And especially important in these times, it includes a dedicated page on migration data related to the global COVID-19 pandemic. Another highlight I would like to share with you is Migration 4.0, a process we started at the beginning of the German presidency. Our symbol, I have to show you our symbol. is a beautiful silver elephant. And this silver elephant stands for the digital transformation, because it takes a lot of energy to move an elephant, but once he is moving, he is very powerful and hard to stop. So this process, Migration 4.0, was meant to spark the digital transformation of migration management and data management by intensifying the dialogue on challenges and chances of digitalization for migration. We focused on three main topics: on digital tools, including obviously data management, on migration forecasting with the use of big data, and communication. We teamed up with strong partners like the European Commission, Frontex, EASO, OECD, ICMPD, CIFA, and IOM. After kickoff meeting in July, we put the topic on the political agenda in SCIFA and organized various deep dives. And additionally, and with the strong support of JIMDAC, we were able to connect this discussion process with the UN network on migration. We created an interactive discussion forum featuring events taking place in the framework and offering space for discussion, participation, and information sharing. I hope that Portugal, as the incoming presidency, might be interested in continuing this fruitful process. Why did we do this? Because we are convinced that digitalization has the potential to make people's lives easier if it is handled with care and prudence. During our presidency, we are also strongly supporting the plans of the European Commission to create an information and data sharing scheme called Blueprint, which involves the creation of a network of migration experts. What is still to come? I am convinced that we can do much more when it comes to data innovation. Initiatives like the Big Data Alliance for Migration are promising. Another focus should be on data capacity building. On Wednesday, like 2 days ago, I participated in a meeting hosted by the African Union, StatAfric, and IOM, focusing on the impact of COVID-19 on migration data. And I still remember that Leila Ben Ali, head of Statistic Division of the African Union, described in an impressive way the huge challenges for migration statistics and obviously for the African economy linked to COVID-19. That's why we, as the German government, we are supporting capacity building projects with partners like IOM and ICMPD. Last point, and I hurried through it all, but because there is honey still to come. So my last point, when we are talking about migration data, when we're talking about issues like early warning systems and migration forecasting tools, we always have to keep in mind that we are not talking about numbers, we are talking about people we care for. So with that, I hand over to you, Hani.
Wonderful. Sorry about that. I pressed the wrong button. Well, yes, I'll take over right there to say that we were very right. We are indeed speaking about people. And because it's about people, once we've gone through the question of how people migrate to Germany, we actually also use data to look at their integration process. And therefore, we established very early in 2015, 16, excuse me, 5 and 6, I'm sorry, a decade ahead, something called the integration monitoring, where we used data to see to what extent people actually participate in different fields. For example, my really favorite example always is to see how many people or how many children with a diverse background leave school with a high school degree in comparison to people without a diverse background, and then to identify where we actually as a state need to take measures. So the first element was data-based analysis of an integration process, of the deficits, The second step then was the National Action Plan on Integration, which is a strategy then to actually, which targets to see where these deficits can be overcome. We have a very current National Action Plan, which is in program, which looks at 5 phases of integration, from pre-departure measures to arrival measures, and then measures which look to what extent people can actually live together and how they live together. And part of that, and that's what I've been invited to speak about today, is also about the question to what extent the role of migrants and their participation in this process. And I would like to highlight very strongly that it was very important to the German government in establishing the strategy and the action plan to speak and work with migrant organizations on an equal level and to make them part of the process rather than the object of the process. And therefore, we have strongly worked not only with them, but also with different organizations who actually work in the field to make sure that it is not a top-down process but more of a bottom-up process looking at the needs of people. And of course, that's one key element of making sure that people with a diverse background in Germany play an active role in matters that are primarily about their participation, their integration. But also, of course, it makes a very strong point that people with a diverse background are part of the society and part of those who actually proactively create programs and different targets. I would like to take one example, as long as my time, I think I have a 3-minute limit. If I'm still in there, I would like to take one example to make it a bit more tangible for you. And that, for example, is the area of people working in institutions with a diverse background. So to make clear the process, the monitoring, the integration monitoring, saw that when there's about 20% people with a diverse background in the German population, only 9% work in the public service, right? So that's where we identified the deficit. In the second stage, in the National Action Plan, we targeted the increase of people with a diverse background in institutions and decided upon both strategies and quotas, which weren't quite implemented, but sort of. The idea was we want to definitely increase the number of people working in the public service. And then, of course, and that's the third element, is when people work in the public service, to make sure that they actually are very visible and are actually in positions where we can see that they are actually in charge. One example I love always saying, which is not really in the competence of the federal government, but more of the lender, is the area of the police, where, of course, people with a diverse background are representing the state on a daily basis and very visible. So to sum up, it's a 3-way process. One, of course, data-based, and that's where I take over from Britta, is that we look where the deficits are. We then take a strategic approach with the National Action Plan on Integration, and we then work on something more or less like affirmative action of making sure that people with a diverse background are very visible in what we do. I hope I've kept my 3 minutes.
So I'm wondering if I am waiting to be invited to come in and moderate, or shall I just press on? I will press on. Thank you very much, Britta and Honey. A really interesting presentation, both about the innovations that Germany is undertaking on getting better quality and more accessible data, and indeed on improving diversity and inclusion and visibility, as you say, in the public sector. Britta, Honey, I beg your pardon, I'm sorry I wasn't able to introduce you properly. I only received your bio a little later, but just to recap to others that, Honey, you've been the Head of Division for Social Integration at the Federal Chancellery since 2011, and before that the State Commissioner for Refugees and Migration and Integration, and worked at the European Parliament and a lawyer in Brussels. So thank you both very much for your contributions. I will now introduce our next speaker, Tim Dixon. Tim is a co-founder of More in Common, an organisation with teams in the US, UK, France and Germany that work on combating polarization and uniting divided societies. Tim has co-authored a series of reports on public attitudes to migration and communication strategy. He was chief speechwriter for 2 Australian Prime Ministers, Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard, and before then, he worked as an entrepreneur and a tech sector lawyer. Based out of New York and London over the past decades, Tim has co-founded 7 social mission organizations working on a wide range of issues, including refugee protection, climate change, post-conflict peace building, civilian protection, inequality, and the role of women in public life. Tim, delighted to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Paul. I'm going to endeavour to share a few slides in a moment just to capture just some very top-line insights from our research. As Paul mentioned, we've done quite a lot of research over the last 3 or 4 years, about $3 or $4 million worth, specifically on xenophobia, immigration attitudes, refugee issues, as well as more generally on understanding the forces that are dividing societies, that are fracturing societies, and how we combat that. The particular focus I'd like to bring is just to say that it's very important in building an evidence-based approach to understanding perceptions of migration, which obviously are having such a strong influence now on policymakers. It's very important to not just look in isolation at percentages, 60% think this, 30% think that, but more to have the wider context. And there's a lot of measurement tools now that we have in a public opinion polling that allow us to get a richer perspective than just looking at those sort of simple numbers. Because to be honest, you can ask a question one way and you get one response. You can ask a question another way, you get another response. It might be useful as an advocacy tool, but it doesn't necessarily give you the insight out of which you can build effective communications. So I'm going to see if I can successfully share my screen here. Just to capture a few of the key insights from our work. So I'm just going to give you 5 points from that sort of very top line across the studies that we've done. We've done specific immigration-related reports in Italy, Greece, France, Germany, and the Netherlands. We have also just recently published a 7-country study, 14,000 people, that includes Italy, Poland, the Netherlands, France, Germany, US, and UK, that's looking specifically at the impact of COVID on public attitudes. And there are some migration questions that we've asked within the context of that research. What we've tried to do is stand back from the detail of day-to-day policy discussions to understand more what's the wider context in which people think about issues of immigration, and particularly what are the psychological kind of mechanisms that are activated when people are thinking about immigration issues. Where does immigration and migrants fit into the way that they see the world? And that's different from looking at these issues purely from the perspective of expertise on migration issues. So one aspect is to try to look at people within their wider context. And that leads us to thinking of the public, not just in terms of a general public, in an overall sense, but looking into the different segments of population. And I've given you here 6 examples of country-based segmentations. It's quite a detailed data science exercise to build these models. But some of the models here that we've done, some of them are migration attitude specific, some of them are more broad about people's social psychology. Actually, your attitudes on migration issues is very much a function of broader aspects of people's social psychology. So both models are quite useful. They do slightly different things, and I'll explain one of those examples in a moment. But in looking at the populations in very simple terms, what we find is, if you sort of think of this as a clock face in what we're presenting here, that between about 12 o'clock and 3 o'clock, you get around a quarter of the population, maybe a little less in some countries, are cosmopolitan in their attitudes, very supportive of migration. Their pro-migration attitudes are part of their identity. At the other end of the clock face, say from sort of 9 o'clock to 12 o'clock, there's a group that is more nationalist, more closed, more opposed to immigration, more threatened. And then there's between the 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock, there is a group or groups that have mixed views, that they have some positive pro-migration attitudes and they also have some negative. And what's important here is to understand the majority of people actually have a mix of views where aspects of how they think about their society and migrants are supportive and others reflect greater concern. Why that is important is that sometimes people, particularly advocates around immigration issues, think of somebody, if they hold a negative view, a negative perception of migrants, they see them as, oh, they're opposed to immigration. Or if they hold a positive view, they see them as pro-migration. But the truth is most people have a mix of views and they kind of balance between competing ideas about the pro and anti sentiment towards migration issues. More specifically, what's behind those are specific issues that are around concerns that people have about immigration, especially if they feel that the immigration systems are not being well managed. So examples of that are concerns about public health, which are very prominent right now, concerns about the loss of control of borders, concerns about the traditional culture and values being threatened by the changing composition and demography of their country. In some places, a concern about terrorism and crime. That's actually quite a natural mechanism in people's psychology, that they see the other people who don't feel like they're part of the community within their community, and they can easily attribute the most negative behaviours to them. And obviously there's a lot of media and disinformation that feeds those perceptions. And there's also concerns about economic issues and the way in which labour markets are affected, housing stresses and stresses on welfare systems might be affected by incoming migration. And typically we find parts of the population that have more concern in one area than another, and some groups that have all of those concerns. But beneath those attitudes, there's something bigger to think about. And that is to say that simply dealing with those concerns at a fact-based level, making the case about how immigration supports, helps economic growth, or demonstrating that there isn't a public health risk from migration and it's well managed, that doesn't necessarily deal with people's concerns and anxieties. And this is where the social psychology is really helpful. Part of our sort of tribal instinct in the human mind is that we very naturally think in us versus them terms. We naturally think of us as part of a group and others as an outside, sort of an in-group, out-group. And when people feel threatened, when they feel insecure, they're much more likely to fall into in-group versus out-group thinking. And the way in which, from a perception communication perspective, we need to deal with that is that we need to counter the othering, counter the otherness, and demonstrate that there is a larger us. And that's really where integration is so important. That is so much more critical than making fact-based arguments in terms of shifting perceptions, because the underlying social psychology, in fact, in a sense, people interpret facts into many people through arguing facts. You do shift people when you deal with that us versus them psychology. I'll give you one example of this, why this is important. This is a question we asked in Germany. It's a question, most Muslims hold similar values to me personally. Now, the liberal cosmopolitan group, which is around a quarter of the population, a little less, overwhelmingly, 71% agrees with that, because their notion of us versus them is a very broad us. Muslims are like us. We're no different, really. We have different beliefs, perhaps, but fundamentally, we're the same as humans. But no other group in the population, the vast majority of Germans, do not agree with that perspective. But why that's particularly important, almost all the people who work on migration communications, in migration advocacy, and probably also in migration policy making in government, belong to that educated liberal cosmopolitan group. So the key insight from that is don't trust your instincts, because the population, other people's views don't necessarily start with the same values frame or experiences as you. And that's why the research is so valuable, because it gives us insight into public attitudes, which can make our communications more effective and mean that we don't rely just on our own instincts. Our instincts are actually really poor guides to deal with these issues, because we just have different, many of us who are involved in this professionally, just have a different way of seeing, thinking through these issues than the majority of the population. That doesn't mean that it's a matter of ignorance or people being wrong. It's just they've got different social psychology, different backgrounds. So another point to make in the current context is just to say that there are particular moments when people might have a different lens on migration, and that's the moment we're in right now. The public health lens as a result of the COVID pandemic means that roughly a quarter of people have become more negative, more hostile, or more against immigration in the current context. But this is not an issue of xenophobia. It's something that we've been tracking in several countries throughout this year. So here's evidence. This is across 6 countries where you see more people becoming more concerned or more against immigration in the current context. But look at this. When you ask a question of should we be allowing doctors and nurses who are trained in foreign countries to practice medicine in this country, this is an example we use in America, because that helps the public health outcomes, which is the lens through which people are thinking in a pandemic. Overwhelmingly, people say we should fast track their certification. If we need people, health experts, health professionals to come in from overseas, we should do that. So in fact, they're very pro-migration in that sense. And so we shouldn't just think that the world is, people's attitudes are pro or anti. It's more complicated than that. The last point then is just to say that when we think across these issues, they are complex. The issues of immigration are very much influenced by deeper things about our identity, our culture, our values, how we think about human rights, and national context is really important as well. We really don't think that international campaigns on migration issues work, because a campaign needs to speak to people's values. Most people are quite nationally specific in their values, and that's why we do a lot of our national studies. So we need to be willing to build evidence-based approaches, to test assumptions, try different approaches, be rigorously evidence-based, and because it's quite sophisticated and complex to do this effectively, I think it's important to build professional networks and create centres of expertise. It's not as easy as just doing a single webinar. We need to develop more sophistication in the way we communicate about these issues, because our effectiveness in those efforts really does have a very significant influence on the public policy outcomes. I'll pause there. Thanks.
Tim, many thanks for that. That was extremely interesting and thought-provoking, and certainly from our perspective here in the UK, much resonates. And actually, I would say from my own experiences living in the developing world, I think there's a lot of resonance there. I don't know if these papers and slides are shared, if there's a common space, but we'd be very interested, I'm sure others would, to see that presentation. So perhaps IOM colleagues can just help us understand where we can find these resources. Thank you again, Tim. Let me introduce now our next speaker, who is Debbie Kohner, who is the Secretary General of the European Network of National Human Rights Institutions, which is a membership network that supports national human rights institutes to promote and protect human rights across wider Europe. Debbie is a qualified solicitor, having practiced law in London and Madrid. She's also worked in the NGO sector, including convening a coalition of equality and human rights organisations in Northern Ireland. Previously, she coordinated a major research project to set up the first reporting system for racist incidents in New Zealand. She's worked at Westminster, the UK Parliament, and has studied law at Jesus College in Oxford, and in Paris, at the College of Europe, as well as in, she studied peace and conflict studies. So you are very welcome, and I hand the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today and to speak with you for this first regional review of the Global Compact on Migration. As you said, I'm representing ENRI, which brings together over 40 national human rights institutions across Europe. And I will therefore focus my intervention on the role of NHRIs and their involvement in the Global Compact, which is particularly important for today's discussions under Objectives 1, 17 and 23. I'll also look at a human rights-based approach to the implementation of the Global Compact on Migration, with examples under Objectives 3 and 23. And finally, look at some of the European regional developments and how they impact on the Global Compact, particularly the EU Pact on Migration. So first of all, for those of you unfamiliar, NHRIs are state-mandated bodies, independent of government, with a broad mandate to promote and protect human rights. Each of them work on migration. It's very much part of their mandate, including advancing a human rights-based approach to migration. They do so through monitoring, advising the state, capacity building, research, advice, reporting to international bodies, and also, where applicable, handling individual complaints. They work collaboratively closely with states, civil society, and international mechanisms, and are accredited periodically by reference to the UN Paris Principles to test their independence. So the existence of these bodies is a global indicator under Sustainable Development Goal 16 as an accelerator for the fulfillment of all other goals. Similarly, they are formally included in the Global Compact and have a growing recognition for their participation in the European intergovernmental mechanisms, but also, of course, the UN, where they have participation rights at the human rights fora. Now, under the Global Compact, partnership with NHRIs is part of the whole of society approach. In turn, NHRIs have committed to assist in the implementation of the GCM at national level. And as we heard from Tim, this national approach and looking at networks at national level is particularly important for implementation. They're also important actors in the provision of data on migration under Objective 1. This flows naturally from their human rights monitoring mandate, as obtaining data is essential to advising on policy and legislation that guarantee an enjoyment of human rights for all migrants. ENRI as a network is focusing on national monitoring at borders, and we've provided capacity building and guidance on this, including how to continue effective monitoring and data collection during the COVID-19 pandemic. Indeed, this monitoring and data provision is essential despite the challenges, and NHRIs continue this work, including in places of detention, even during the COVID-19 challenges. We've also supported European NHRIs in their promotion mandate, including positive value-based communications of migrants' human rights in line with Objective 17, which Tim has addressed so well. ENRI has provided a written submission, which is available on the documents tab, but NHRIs have expertise on a broad range of migration issues, focused on the centrality of ensuring a human rights-based approach to migration. Now, most European NHRIs have increased their work in this area over recent years, and particularly since 2015, with the rise in the number of arrivals of migrants in Europe, and in particular, the subsequent actions from states, which led to several human rights concerns. NHRIs have contributed to the growing body of evidence indicating the existence of widespread violations of migrants' human rights in Europe. Through their human rights-based approach, focus on international human rights standards, empowering the most vulnerable to participate in decision-making processes, and holding duty bearers accountable, NHRIs look towards the implementation of the Global Compact in Europe through a concerted effort, which also, of course, requires the commitment from the European countries and European Union. The evidence, sadly, from NHRIs shows that migrants' human rights continue to be systematic national and the EU's external borders. And I'd like to pay particular attention, first of all, to Objective 3, when looking at the need for accurate and timely information at all stages of migration. As we raised in our written submission, human rights violations have become the normal reality, sadly, in many of the EU's external borders. This includes blatant violations of the principle of non-refoulement, the right to apply for asylum, and also through pushbacks, which have included repeated violence in many states. The effective and efficient provision of information to migrants is decisive for migrants' access to procedures, international protection, and remedies, but also for their future integration. Without adequate information, a migrant will face difficulties in seeking, for example, medical or humanitarian services, or in filing asylum claims. Informing migrants on their rights also impacts their empowerment and autonomy. The data collected by NHRIs in Europe shows that there's still some way to go before migrants truly have access to information that is needed. Access to professional interpretation, translation, identification of information on special needs, as well as training and the qualification of reception staff are often the main obstacles. Secondly, when looking at Objective 23 and the need for international cooperation and global partnerships, NHRIs are core to assisting in solidarity and cooperation across regions. It is fundamental, and respect of the primacy of international human rights and refugee law should be included in these cooperation processes. In addition, cooperation with third countries should never be to the detriment of the rights of migrants, refugees, and asylum applicants. It's really cooperation about solidarity, and in the EU, more solidarity is required for a fair share of the asylum applicants and refugees to ensure that there is not an unbalanced burden at the borders, and to ensure that migrants' integration can be spread across the EU. In the EU Pact, some elements can be welcomed, but there has also been some concerns raised about achieving this solidarity and also focusing on returns or avoiding responsibilities to host asylum applicants and refugees. ENRI provides a network for solidarity and cross-border cooperation for NHRIs in Europe. This is essential for human rights accountability, monitoring, and reporting, since it is only through acquiring information from both sides of borders that national and regional authorities can have a full understanding of the human rights impact of border governance. Migration is intrinsically a cross-border topic, so it also requires a cross-border approach to human rights compliance. ENRI's and European NHRI's cooperation goes beyond Europe, and we work alongside the Global Alliance of NHRIs and the other regional networks in Africa, Asia Pacific, and the Americas. I'd like to finally look at the regional developments, in particular the EU Pact on Migration. It is essential that the EU Pact on Migration reinforces the commitments under the Global Compact and certainly does not contradict them. There have been some positive developments, such as a call for a more positive narrative on migration, which of course needs to be translated now into concrete actions. There has also been a call to establish monitoring mechanisms at borders, and these must be national and independent bodies. This is essential for human rights accountability, and ENRI has seen and argued, in fact, for the efficient use of existing national structures, and NHRIs can provide an important role in this regard. However, the pact does contain several problematic proposals which could actually come into contradiction with the Global Compact on Migration. For example, there's a continued focus on border procedures, which could result in a persisting unbalanced burden at external borders. There's an expanding of the scope for detention at borders, which of course should be avoided where possible and always for children. There's a reduction in timeframes, which could in practice impact on migrants' ability to receive information, including on their rights and the ability to apply for asylum or to challenge a decision. Finally, there's a focus on returns, while practice shows that there are persisting human rights violations in Europe, including of the principle of non-refoulement. In conclusion, and as we have heard, the effective implementation of the Global Compact on Migration in Europe, it truly requires a concerted effort from a variety of actors, including civil society, NHRIs, and of course, the states, where we need to see a stronger commitment from European countries and the European Union to ensure a human rights-based approach to migration. Evidence from NHRIs will continue to be delivered to both states and regional and international mechanisms, and we hope that the current evidence of systematic violation of migrants' human rights will be decreased and come to an end. The Council of Europe and its regional human rights system, as well as strong fundamental rights protection at EU level, and I must say a strong civil society landscape, as well as NHRIs, Europe has a good foundation to face these challenges and ensure that human rights of all migrants are respected. But for the Global Compact on Migration to become a lived reality in Europe, much more needs to be done. This includes in relation to a human rights-based approach and real solidarity and cooperation between European states. NHRIs will continue to work for the respect of human rights of migrants and the implementation of the Global Compact on Migration. ENRI stands ready to work alongside all partners at international and regional level to discuss how NHRIs can contribute further in assessing the implementation of the Global Compact on Migration in Europe and making sure that states are respecting the commitments. It is only through a collaborative and concerted effort that the respect of migrants' human rights in Europe will become a reality. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Debbie, in particular for that very clear description of the human rights situation regarding migrants in Europe and the clear and forensic analysis of the EU Migration Pact and how that contrasts or takes forward, and in some cases potentially conflict with the Global Compact. I'm sure we'll hear more on that from our speakers later. I'm now going to introduce our next speaker, Birgit. Birgit van Hout is the regional representative for Europe, leading the UN Human Rights Regional Office for Europe in Brussels since 2017. Previously, Birgit worked to advance human rights, the rule of law, democracy, and equality in Guatemala, Timor-Leste, Bosnia, Central Asia, Palestine, Venezuela, and Togo, with various departments of the UN, the EU, and the OSCE. Birgit, you're very welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to join you today for the first regional review of the Global Compact. The High Commissioner for Human Rights has welcomed the Global Compact for Migration as a commitment to improve migration governance by putting the dignity and human rights of migrants at the center. Indeed, the Global Compact provides a principled roadmap to ensure the effective respect, protection, and fulfillment of migrants' human rights, as stipulated in its paragraph 12. By implementing the Global Compact, we have a unique opportunity to advance the Sustainable Development Agenda as well, by fulfilling the commitment to leave no one behind and to reach the furthest behind first. This is an opportunity we cannot miss. The regional reviews of the Global Compact are coming at a critical time. The COVID-19 crisis has shed light on structural inequalities and exacerbated many pre-existing human rights challenges faced by migrants. At the same time, many migrants have been and continue to be frontline workers in the struggle against the pandemic, often at great risk for their own health. If the pandemic has taught us one thing, it is how interconnected we are and how much we depend on one another for our health and well-being. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrates that only measures that protect the human rights of all people are effective. Similarly, it shows us that no state can address global cross-border issues on its own, which underscores the need for international and regional cooperation. The principles that the COVID-19 pandemic is urging us to embrace, namely the people-centered approach, the centrality of human rights to our collective well-being, and the need for international cooperation, are precisely the principles that inspired and guided the Global Compact for Migration. In times of COVID-19, the Global Compact constitutes a powerful framework to recognize migrants as essential partners in our collective response and to develop inclusive public health, socio-economic, and protection responses. We welcome countries that are taking concrete action to reduce risks and vulnerabilities faced by migrants in the context of the pandemic, precisely in the direction that the Global Compact prescribes. We have seen Ireland provide migrants, regardless of status, with access to COVID-related healthcare services. We've seen Portugal and Italy extending visa and residence permits to avoid migrants falling into an irregular status. We've seen Spain and Belgium deciding to create alternatives to immigration detention. And we've seen Bulgaria, Denmark, Lithuania, the Russian Federation, and Canada to suspend forced returns. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Objective 1 of the Global Compact talks about data collection and evidence-based policies. But from our experience around the world, we also know that the most effective policies are those that are implemented in a participatory and inclusive manner. We therefore welcome the creation by the European Commission of an expert group of migrants to collect their views on integration policies. As we've heard from previous speakers, this regional review comes as EU member states are negotiating a new EU pact on migration and asylum. Even though a number of countries in Europe did not adopt the Global Compact, we still hope that the EU institutions and member states will be guided by its content and spirit as they engage in negotiations on the proposed EU pact. The Global Compact commitments can meaningfully guide deliberations on the identification, screening, referral, and assistance to migrants in vulnerable situations, on establishing independent human rights monitoring, on ensuring that returns are safe and dignified, and that reintegration is indeed sustainable. In Objective 3 of the Global Compact, states committed to providing accurate and timely information at all stages of migration. The proposed EU Pact on Migration and Asylum provides pre-entry screening for all third country nationals who cross the EU border without prior authorization. The accelerated border procedure will take up to 10 days, during which it is determined if a migrant is relocated or returned immediately. It is unclear in that situation if and how access to information, legal aid, and medical care will be guaranteed during the pre-entry screening procedure. The proposed EU Pact also adopts a binary approach between asylum and return, which implies that everyone who is denied asylum should be immediately returned. The spirit of the Global Compact, however, calls for a fair procedure that allows migrants to avail themselves of other existing procedures for regularization that may exist in national legislation of EU member states. For instance, more than half of EU member states provide a temporary residence permit on medical grounds. At least 5 countries have legislation granting special permits for undocumented victims of domestic violence. And at least 8 countries have regularization mechanisms for children, young people, or families. How will migrants be able to access these procedures in the accelerated pre-entry screening process? Let me move to Objective 7 of the Global Compact, namely to address and reduce vulnerabilities in migration. It is important to clarify that the term vulnerability does not imply an inherent weakness on the part of the person. Vulnerability, as well as the risk of violating the principle of non-refoulement, need to be assessed, as we all know, through an individualized process. It is also important that migration policies do not make vulnerabilities worse. For example, while we welcome that the proposed EU Pact stipulates that the best interest of the child shall be a primary consideration, that increased resources for guardians for unaccompanied children are foreseen, and non-discriminatory access to education granted, we regret that the proposed EU Pact does not uphold the definition of a child as set out in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, as it limits child-specific safeguards only to children below the age of 12 instead of 18 as prescribed in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I would like to refer to the publication Principles and Guidelines on the Human Rights Protection of Migrants in Vulnerable Situations, developed under the leadership of our office to assist states with the design, implementation, and monitoring of measures to protect the human rights of migrants in vulnerable situations. The tool covers how to reduce vulnerabilities in the context of rescue and immediate assistance, as well as topics like border governance, human rights-based return, alternatives to immigration detention, and human rights monitoring. As you may know, the Global Compact encourages states to draw on this tool to inform the delivery of a human rights-based global compact. And we believe that it could also usefully inform discussions on the new EU Pact on Migration and Asylum. Some promising practices are already being undertaken by states in the UNECE region to address situations of vulnerability. Canada has, for instance, introduced an open work permit for workers in vulnerable situations so that migrants can leave an abusive employment situation without jeopardizing their authorization to work. We've also mapped promising local practices by cities and regions in 8 EU countries to ensure migrants' access to health. These promising practices include regulations that allow irregular migrants to register with general medical practitioners, municipal medical centers that provide migrants with treatments that they cannot access through the national system, or reimbursement schemes for medical practitioners attending to undocumented migrants. While these practices are, of course, motivated by the desire of local authorities to uphold human rights, in particular the non-discrimination principle, they also tend to be driven by the very practical public health consideration that it is in the interest of the community as a whole that everyone is healthy. In Objective 17 of the Global Compact, states committed to eliminate all forms of discrimination, xenophobia, and intolerance against migrants and asylum seekers. We still have a lot to do in this area. I would like to take but one example, that of the Roma living outside their country of nationality. Our office has documented forced evictions of Roma migrants, often interrupting the schooling of their children in violation of international human rights law. We sincerely hope that the new EU framework for Roma inclusion and participation will lead all countries in Europe to seriously address homelessness and housing segregation of Roma women, men, and children, and will also proactively tackle prejudice and intolerance against the Roma, which unfortunately remains widespread across the continent. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Objective 17 also calls for a more realistic, humane, and constructive public discourse on migration. Political leaders carry a special responsibility, since they have the power to shape the debate and to shift public opinion either positively or negatively. Some political leaders relentlessly scapegoat migrants for electoral gain, rather than promoting dignity and dialogue. In some countries, hatred has penetrated mainstream politics. If we want to make Objective 17 a reality, it is essential that political leaders refrain from hate speech and speak out firmly and promptly against it. On International Migrants Day, our office will launch an online toolbox based on 7 key elements on building human rights-based narratives on migrants and migration. This toolbox offers ideas, actions, and inspiration on how to create hope and values-based narratives on migration. As part of this project, our regional office has been working with civil society partners in Poland, Spain, and Belgium to amplify positive stories of migrants and communities. Short videos on social media highlight how we are all connected and depend on each other no matter where we come from. They lay testimony to our common humanity and that caring for each other and respecting everyone's rights leads to better outcomes for all. We hope our toolbox will encourage and empower more people to stand up for the human rights of migrants, and that states and regional organizations that have not yet done so will join the effort. I'm afraid that for too long, state responses to migration have been uncoordinated and at times ad hoc and unilateral. For too long, they are failing to see migrants as fellow human beings. For too long, they have failed to uphold their safety, dignity, and rights. The Global Compact for Migration provides another path forward, a path of cooperation, solidarity, and respect for human rights. It recognizes that migration is a cross-border phenomenon that no state can govern alone. Actions taken by one government will necessarily affect others, both regionally and globally. Therefore, we cannot hope to address migration in all of its dimensions without stepping up international and regional cooperation. We strongly encourage states and the European Union to draw on the Global Compact in their policies and practices, and to maximize synergies with ongoing processes. The new EU Pact on Migration and Asylum has been mentioned several times, but there is also the EU-Africa strategy and the renewed EU partnership with the Southern Neighborhood. As Debbie mentioned, Europe has a solid architecture and the means to live up to the ambitions of the Global Compact. With strong regional organizations, the EU, the Council of Europe, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, strong regional protection mechanisms, independent national human rights institutions and equality bodies in many countries, not to mention a vibrant civil society and media. European countries should leverage multi-stakeholder forums, policy tools, and funding to translate the objectives of the Global Compact into concrete actions. The UN Human Rights Office is committed to supporting regional organizations and states in their endeavors. Thank you.
Birgit, many thanks for that. Very clear summary of some of the human rights issues facing migrants and the strengths and weaknesses of the European approach and architecture that we have. So I think that now concludes the interventions from our panelists. We have a long list of very distinguished colleagues who will now speak from the floor. And I'm going to hand over to Elisa, I think, to moderate the interventions from the floor. Elisa, over to you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. You asked earlier about the presentations, about the documents. These will be shared through the website of the UN Network of Migration, and everything will be posted there. So all information can be shared with the email address 2020 GCM regional review. That has been the address through which we all communicated, and it will be uploaded on the website. Also, I wanted to remind those speakers who have asked for the floor, there's been a parallel communication through the private chat box, so they can check their messages for the order, particularly, or when they will be speaking. And now I will first call Portugal, the Secretary of State for Integration and Migration, Ms. Claudia Pereira, to take the floor. Ms. Pereira.
Good morning. Good morning to all of you. I would like to thank the moderators and the insightful discussion of the panel. As we all know, facts, data, and evidences are very important in migration. In Portugal, we count on Observatory for Migration that provides data and information regarding migrants living in Portugal and the dimensions of integration. And in a world where more than ever, this information causes dangerous discourses, let me just show you an evidence that speaks for itself. Last year, the contribution of the immigrants to Portuguese social security system was 884 million euros. I repeat, 884 million euros. This means the difference between what the immigrants contributed and what they received. The social security system benefited from this amount. And this is a clear indicator of the benefits of migrants for hosting societies. And I would like to suggest that more countries would have this indicator available. And as we all know, all the measures taken to help immigrants are a win-win for the public policy, as they protect citizens from getting into vulnerable situation and help to enhance orderly, safe, and regular migration. This can only be done if we have evidence in the field. And in the case of the pandemic, the impacts clearly stated vulnerabilities of the immigrants, for which in Portugal we developed 4 measures. First, documentation and regularization. And as Ms. Brigitte Van Hout already mentioned, we did an extraordinary and temporary regularization of all immigrants and asylum seekers in the national territory. So the ones who had pending applications on the Immigration and Border Services, they had their applications regular. This was very, very important for them to access social support, food programs, and others. And we covered more than 246,000 immigrants. Secondly, social protection. We mapped the needs and vulnerabilities of immigrants throughout the whole territory to establish appropriate social responses as food programs, and to ensure that children and young people under vulnerable situations were granted access to education. So some programs, just the Choices program, just delivered the homework of children at home who did not have laptops or internet, and this was done with more than 4,000 children per week. Third, access to health. We had exemption of charges for the diagnosis and treatment of the COVID for migrants. And four, last, access to information. We wanted to ensure that the immigrants had all the information. So through the High Commissioner for Migration, we translated permanently all the materials during alluding to the pandemic and made awareness-raising actions. So we translated the materials to Arabic, Urdu, Nepali, Creole, and other languages. And to end, as our Prime Minister and the President of the Republic said, more than ever, we should treat immigrants as we would like Portuguese abroad to be treated. Because this pandemic affects us all and does not look at nationalities. So we really would like to thank having the opportunity of this specific program, of this instrument, of the Global Compact for Migration, because particularly during the pandemic and before, it really helped us in reducing inequalities between nationals and immigrants, in promoting equal rights to nationals and to immigrants, and in building a better society. Thank you very much and keep safe.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pereira. And I will call now Ambassador de la Marche, Belgium. And the subsequent speakers will be from Spain and Sweden. The floor is yours, Ambassador.
Thank you, Mrs. Coordinator. I would like to thank the IOM as coordinator of the UN Network on Migration and the Economic Commission for Europe for convening this regional review meeting. And thank you for the opportunity to make a statement on behalf of the Belgian government. Belgium welcomes this regional review and hopes it will contribute to a common understanding and sharing of lessons learned with regard to the overall objective of improving international cooperation on safe, orderly, and regular migration. Belgium filed a voluntary contribution in preparation of this meeting, which presents a state of play based on a mapping exercise conducted in early 2020 on the implementation of the 23 objectives of the GCM. An addendum to the report discusses the measures taken in the asylum and migration domain following the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. Belgian public institutions involved in the asylum and migration policy, both at federal and regional level, contributed to the report and addendum. As such, we took a whole-of-government approach regarding migration, which will serve as a baseline to measure future progress on the implementation of the Global Compact. As can be recalled, the adoption of the GCM triggered a political crisis in Belgium and led to a minority government, followed by caretaker government after federal elections in May 2019. Despite these difficult circumstances and limited capacity, the caretaker government started reflections on the development of a long-term strategy and action plan. And the voluntary contribution could be considered as a result of this effort. Without being exhaustive, I would like to point to some of the results and practices mentioned in the report that we believe are interesting to share. On Objective 1, an independent public institution, the Federal Migration Center, MIRIA, strives to make data and analysis on migration in Belgium more accessible to policymakers and the general public. On Objective 9 and 10, the adoption of appropriate legislation and whole of government strategies and action plans to combat human trafficking and smuggling. Objective 21, the development of a robust trajectory, network, and financial and administrative support system for voluntary return and reintegration that is internationally recognized. Objective 15 and 7, the continued provision of basic services to applicants of international protection throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, and of access to COVID-19 related emergency health services free of charge for undocumented migrants. On Objective 23, the elaboration of a broad strategy on migration and development, soon to be finalized. And on Objective 18 and 5, the implementation of a number of pilot programs in North and West Africa on labor and circular migration by the Belgian Development Agency Enable, on which we plan to inform you at the next summit of the Global Forum on Migration and Development. On October 1st, 2020, a new federal government took office. The coalition agreement confirms the human rights-based approach of the Belgian asylum and migration policy and recognizes the importance of multilateral cooperation on migration, including the UN Global Compact on Migration. Priorities of the new government include a new asylum and migration code, a humane but firm return policy, an increased focus on the management of migration flows in a coherent approach with Belgium's foreign policy, support for qualitative reception and protection of refugees in their region of origin, and the stepping up of the fight against both trafficking and smuggling of human beings. Various other measures are announced that will contribute to a more GCM-compliant migration policy in Belgium. For example, and it was already mentioned, the government will further develop alternatives to detention of migrants without legal status, and a decision was taken to refrain from detaining minors in closed centers. Finally, the new government confirms that Belgium will remain a strong advocate for the development and strengthening of a common European asylum and migration policy, and will continue to play an active leading role and positive role in this. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I will now invite Spain, Ambassador for Migratory Affairs, as I mentioned, to be followed by Sweden and subsequently by Ireland, Armenia, and Greece. Ambassador Pardo.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. Spain develops a global approach to migration since 2005, embracing a well-led division of the Global Compact. In practical terms, therefore, Spain is implementing the GCM well before its adoption. The priority of Objective 1 is well established. We have enlarged the contents and the public access to the statistical databases on regular migration within the National Institute of Statistics and both Ministries of Interior and Migration. They are intelligently complemented by statistics at regional and local governments levels. Statistics of irregular migration are still a challenge, but data on irregular arrivals by sea are updated every 15 days and publicly available in the webpage of the Ministry of Interior. The same applies to save and rescue statistics are shared with EU agencies, Frontex, the ESO, and international organizations, IOM, UNHCR. We think that public access to statistics enhances the whole of society approach of the Compact. As far as Objective 3 is concerned, Each of the three ministries, Interior, Migration, and Foreign Affairs, assure free public access pages in the respective official websites with updated information on regular migration options to Spain. The Spanish Agency for International Cooperation carries out projects in several North and Western African countries of awareness of the risk of using criminal migratory networks. Reduced vulnerabilities in migration is more than a moral issue. In many cases, migrants' rights violations and vulnerabilities begin at home, and this situation can worsen in transit and in destination. We must act in all these three migratory scenarios. Objective 7 is therefore paramount. In our 40 pages report on national implementation of DCM, 5 pages were devoted to illustrate the measures undertaken by different departments on this issue, especially by the Ministry of Inclusion, Social Security and Migration. And special attention is paid to the most vulnerable, like women, legislative and regulatory positive discrimination schemes for migrants, abuse, or victims of sexual trafficking and domestic violence, and unaccompanied minors, the recent adoption of the permit to work for not accompanied minors aged 16 onwards. We have worked intensely to combat the new vulnerabilities of migrants and refugees caused by COVID pandemic. I would highlight the adoption this very summer of a permanent national scheme on minimal vital income passed by vast majority in the Spanish Parliament, accessible not only to nationals but also to migrants and their families with at least 1 year of legal and uninterrupted residence in Spain. It was decided an automatic extension of the validity of residence and work permits expire during the administrative closure due to the pandemic, and we have facilitated their renewal afterwards. At the same time, it has been facilitated the access to the acknowledging to the legal figure of arraigo social, social routine, to fight subsequent involuntary irregularity for economic reasons. In summer 2019, it was resumed the universal access to the National Health Service for all migrants regardless legal status. This measure has proved its efficiency during the pandemic. Promoting inclusion of migrants in host society is a priority in the Spanish migratory policy. Active public policies to combat discrimination and toxic migratory narratives are needed to attain this aim. In the context of Objective 17 of the DCM, the National Observatory for Countering Xenophobia and Racism in a whole of society and whole of government approach in close cooperation with social integration departments in regions and cities, academia, and civil society, develop initiatives to anchor a non-biased perception of migration, especially among young generations. An interministerial framework was adopted in late 2018 in order to implement the national strategy to combat racism, xenophobia, and other forms of discrimination, dating 2011. In fighting hate crimes, Spain is in the international forefront, both in terms of legislation, after the reform of Article 510 of Penal Code in 2015, and implementation. In 2019, the Ministry of Justice, through the State Attorney General, adopted guidelines of prosecution, and the Ministry of Interior established a national action plan and a national office of fighting hate crimes. Finally, we know, but sometimes we forget, that no single country or region can cope alone with all the challenges of contemporary migration. International cooperation based in solidarity and responsibility is not an option but a must if we take seriously the DCM conception of migration as a common endeavor. Concerning Objective 23, on top of advocating for an even sounder EU migratory extended dimension in current negotiations on the European Pact, the Spanish bilateral migratory cooperation prioritizes Northern Africa, Sahel region, and Western Africa. In mid-2021, Spain will hold the presidency of the Rabat process. Outside the American continent, my country is probably the most sensitive and directly concerned by human mobility from Latin America. Spain organized in May 2020 with the EU, IOM, UNHCR, the second donor conference on migratory and asylum challenges from the Venezuelan crisis, and currently holds the presidency of the platform MIRPS on the mixed fluxes challenges in Central America and Mexico. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I will now pass the floor to Sweden, Mr. Thomas. I will also ask kindly to keep in mind to pace the presentation. I understand that we are looking for the time bearing in mind also the simultaneous interpretation that takes place. Thank you. Mr. Thomas.
Thank the UN Network on Migration and the UNEC for convening this first regional review. Sweden voted for the Global Compact for safe, orderly and regular migration. We are in favor of multilateralism through a 360-degree vision of international migration in a non-legally binding cooperative framework. We recognize the need for a comprehensive approach. Sweden's implementation of the GCM is led by the Ministry of Justice, which is also responsible for national migration policy. We follow standard procedures within the government office for ensuring a whole-of-government perspective. Sweden's implementation of the GCM is grounded in the premise that the 23 objectives are already met through existing laws and policies on migration and related topics. Furthermore, Sweden takes note of the GCM being firmly anchored in the 2030 agenda. With these two factors in mind, our reporting on the implementation of the GCM is currently focusing on Objective 23 and the strengthening of migration cooperation with third countries. I will mention a few examples of our support to GCM implementation. Sweden is providing IOM with core funding, which is likely earmarked to strengthen IOM's capacity to coordinate the UN network on migration. Sweden has also contributed to the UN Migration Multi-Partner Trust Fund. Of relevance to GCM Objective 1, the regional program to improve migration statistics for development in Africa is funded by the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA, and coordinated by Statistics Sweden in collaboration with the IOM and the African Union. The program has strong links to the 2030 agenda and aims to increase the capacity to describe intra-continental migration between regional economic communities in Africa and strengthen the availability and awareness of gender-sensitive migration data. Sweden has also co-funded IOM in setting up the Global Policy Network on Ethical Recruitment of relevance for GCM Objectives 3, 6, and 7. Similarly, the Swedish Public Employment Service is running a project under the title International Training Program for Productive Employment, and this is contributing with establishing labor market information. Sweden also participates in the EU project Actions, which promotes safe and legal labor migration between Senegal, Mauritania, Cape Verde, Togo, and Ghana. The Swedish Migration Agency has supported the Turkish Directorate General of Migration Management linked to GCM Objective 7 with a focus on vulnerable migrants. So these are only some examples of GCM implementation by Sweden. Finally, Sweden sees an overall need for capacity building and support to developing countries. We hope that the UN network can identify project-based cooperation and will be able to share information among member states about GCM-related projects. This may help in avoiding duplication of work, as well as seeking synergies and facilitating regional and partnerships. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. I will call now Ireland, Ambassador Gaffey, to be followed by Armenia and Greece, and subsequently by the delegation of the European Union. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all our panelists today and all participants in this first review. Given the time constraints, I would like to focus briefly on an area that can be considered a linchpin for the ambitious agenda we have set ourselves, and that's public attitudes and information. And I would really like to thank Tim Dixon for his really interesting research and data in his presentation. So we have to recognize that implementing the objectives of the compact requires decisions which in today's environment are going to be regarded by some as politically risky or even unpopular. So if we are serious about creating the best possible environment for implementation across all 23 objectives of the compact, we need to look at public attitudes and the narratives that shape them. Misleading narratives on migrants and migration based on misinformation or deliberate disinformation are unfortunately a phenomenon of our times. But the direction of public discourse is not all one way. And as we have heard throughout this regional review, the COVID pandemic has actually highlighted the vital role that people who have migrated to many of our countries have played and are playing in keeping essential services going. Objective 17 commits us to countering misleading narratives. This doesn't mean placing restrictions on free speech, and it doesn't mean using our positions as governments or international organizations to take control of the narratives. What it requires is that we ensure that the facts are out there and they can be understood on the basis of clear evidence. And here objective 1 of the GCM is key, and that people are made aware of how to access them. We need a narrative based on truth rather than on untruth to emerge naturally and clearly. There is work to be done on different levels with different entry points, and Ireland is keen to play its part in moving this work forward, including through our membership of the GFMD Working Group on Public Narratives on Migration, which is currently developing in collaboration with IOM, a communications campaign to showcase migrants' contributions and help balance the narrative. I would also like to mention at this stage that we are working as Ireland directly with IOM on the establishment of a global migration media academy, which will focus on providing training to media professionals in order to equip them with the tools to counter misleading and untruthful narratives on migration. We very much look forward to being able to report on what this has achieved when we meet in 2022 for the International Migration Review Forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'll pass the floor to Armenia, asking kindly to keep a short intervention. We are arriving towards the end of the roundtable 4 and to give more time to as many speakers in view of the closing session that follows. I'll ask for as much briefness as possible.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Sakiri, and also our thanks to the moderator and to the distinguished panelists for their remarks. We also would like to express our appreciation to IOM for organizing this two-day meeting, which served as an important purpose of taking stock of implementation of Global Compact for Migration. Armenia was actively involved in negotiations on the compact and throughout the process advocated for strong and action-oriented document with pragmatic commitments with anti-discrimination and human rights-based approach at the heart, while also emphasizing safe and regular environment as a fundamental enabler to maximize positive potential of migration. At the national level, while elaborating policies and strategies for migration management, we aim links between Global Compact and 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. At the moment, migration management structures in Armenia are preparing for a comprehensive institutional reforms, which will consolidate the number of migration-related activities and ensure better synergies and coordination. As a nation with large diaspora, migration trends influence Armenia, and our policies are directed to maximizing development impact and mitigating negative consequences of migration. A number of goals reflected in objectives 19 and 20 of the Global Compact were embedded in small and large-scale projects, enabling thousands of diaspora members to utilize their potential in Armenia. One of the most recent examples is the project which creates opportunities for highly skilled young professionals to work in public sector. Let me also stress that Armenia attaches utmost importance to solid legal framework and its institutional systems to counter irregular migration, trafficking in human beings, and related activities. We established multidimensional effective cooperation with partner countries, as well as international structures in a wide range of sectors, such as integrated border management, document security, as well as very well-functioning readmission systems with large number of readmission agreements and implementing protocols in place. Mr. Chair, the aggression committed by Azerbaijan against Nagorno-Karabakh has resulted in a new wave of forced displacement. Thousands of Armenians left their ancestral homes since Azerbaijan, hand in hand with jihadi mercenaries, was committing despicable atrocity crimes against the civilian population, grossly violating international humanitarian law, which included beheading prisoners of war and mutilation of corpses. All these crimes are very well documented, and their perpetrators will be brought to justice. The leadership of Azerbaijan did not make a secret that it aims at erasing all traces of Armenians from Artsakh. The High Commissioner of Human Rights has recently confirmed that the actions of Azerbaijan may amount to war crimes. It is our firm conviction that all those who have left their homes, including in the areas currently occupied by Azerbaijan, should return in safety and dignity with the assistance and control of international organizations. The role of UNHCR has been specifically mentioned in the statement of the heads of states of Armenia, Russia, and Azerbaijan. The statement was aimed at establishment of ceasefire and deployment of peacekeepers in Artsakh. All issues concerning Nagorno-Karabakh peace process are subject to discussion exclusively within the format of OSCE Minsk Group co-chairmanship. I thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker, please. Greece. This is Yorgan Zoglu.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Good afternoon from the Permanent Mission of Greece in Geneva. I just want to make a few comments regarding allegations on pushbacks in the Aegean Sea expressed at the previous panel by the representative of OSCE, Mr. Kopari. In this respect, I would like to stress that Greece denies categorically any pushbacks. And let me stress that the Greek government has repeatedly stated that the Hellenic police and Coast Guard officers perform continuously their rescue activities against the backdrop of an unfavorable environment of fake news systematically reproduced by the media with the aim to harm our officers' reputation and to demoralize them. Fake news are emanating in most cases by the smugglers' networks and by all those supporting them. Greece has made a priority the fight against smugglers and has been active at a European level to reinforce action, including in the countries of origin and transit. Actions by the Greek authorities are carried out in full compliance with the country's international obligations as provided for in the UNCLOS, the International Convention for Safety of Life at Sea, and the International Convention on Maritime Search and Rescue. Thank you.
Thank you. I will pass the floor to the EU delegation. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Hi, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to all the panelists for their very interesting presentations. Allow me please to make a few comments on behalf of the European External Action Service and the European Commission services in line with our written submission. The global challenges we face in today's world requires effective multilateral approaches based on solidarity, human rights, and a rules-based international order. Building strong partnerships with countries of origin, transit, and destination, and working towards a comprehensive and balanced framework for engagement with partners to address migration is a key element of the European Union's migration policy. In line with the guiding principles of the GCM, the EU has been engaged in building genuine and tailor-made partnerships to support partner countries to strengthen their capacity in the areas of migration. Bilateral, regional, and multilateral dialogues have been intensified and encompass issues such as saving lives at sea, protecting the human rights of migrants, developing evidence-based migration governance systems, tackling migrant smuggling and human trafficking, enhancing border management, visa facilitation, promoting legal and circular migration and mobility, return readmission, and sustainable reintegration, as well as addressing the root causes of irregular migration.
You have to write to him.
Excuse me? Should I go ahead?
Yes, sorry.
In particular, partnership with African countries is being further strengthened, building also on the implementation of actions under the 5 pillars of the Joint Valletta Action Plan, cooperation within the Khartoum and Rabat processes, and in the context of the cooperation with the African Union on migration. Migration and mobility are also part of the new 2020 EU communication towards a comprehensive strategy with Africa and of the next cycle of EU-ACP relations. A close strategic partnership has been put in place with UN agencies in the context of the Trilateral African Union, European Union, United Nations Task Force to address the situation of migrants and refugees stranded in Libya. Thanks to the work of the task force and with support of the Trust Fund, around 53 voluntary humanitarian returns have taken place since 2017. Assistance is being provided at disembarkation points, at detention centers when access is possible, and to support host communities, as well as promoting alternatives to detention. Building on this comprehensive approach and the activities briefly outlined, as many people before me speaking have mentioned, on 23rd of September 2020, the European Commission published a new pact on migration and asylum as a fresh start on migration for the EU. Discussions on the proposed pact with EU member states in the Council and in the European Parliament were launched. The proposed pact addresses both the internal and external dimension of the EU's migration policy. Externally, the new pact proposes to consolidate and reinforce cooperation with third countries based on the approach of tailor-made and mutually beneficial partnerships with countries and regions, as well as in international organizations and at a multilateral level, and ensuring ownership on all sides of all dimensions of our cooperation on migration. Supporting our partners in developing effective migration management capacity and governance is an example of the mutually beneficial partnerships we seek to develop. The EU stands ready to help with expertise and capacity building. Depending on the specific situation and needs of a third country, the support can include capacity building of the border and coast guards, including strengthening search and rescue capacities, support in the elaboration of national migration and asylum legislation and strategies, creating asylum and reception capacities, protecting migrants' rights by combating discrimination and labor exploitation, or stepping up the fight against migrant smuggling. And as the last point, allow me to underline the need for improving cooperation on return and admission, combined with support for sustainable reintegration, which is altogether an important element of our renewed partnership with third countries. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I see that the ambassador of Azerbaijan has asked for the floor. Ambassador. Hello?
Ambassador, can you please unmute your microphone? At the center of the screen, there's a mute, unmute button with the microphone icon.
Ambassador, if you could use the chat box to send the request so that we can process it accordingly. In the meantime, as we are approaching the end almost, and I will call for Quakers in Europe to take the floor.
Hello, good afternoon, esteemed colleagues. The Quaker Council for European Affairs is a Brussels-based organization working to bring the Quakers' commitment to peace, justice, and equality to Europe and its institution. The Global Compact mentioned both migrants and diaspora, acknowledging that there is no clear-cut answer to the question, when does migration end? In order for the Objective 17 to be achieved, Objective 1 also needs to be given due consideration. There is a reluctance in too many countries of the EC region to collect migration-related equality data beside number of entries and returns. The lack of quantitative but also qualitative data on integration, education achievement, or health outcome of migrant and diaspora leads to politics that reinforce stereotypes and policy making by assumptions. For example, while data shows migrant women in Europe tend to be skilled and educated, they are also more likely to be overqualified for the job and less likely to be in employment because of essentialist narratives of helpless, housebound, and uneducated women, or ideas that migrants' journey once in a new country must start at the bottom of the ladder. And those ideas are not challenged enough by policy and initiative, creating some of the vulnerabilities Objective 7 seeks to avoid. The lack of accurate and disaggregated data in the context of COVID-19 is also literally having life or death consequences on migrants and diasporas. In some of the few countries that collect data on ethnicity, measures are being considered to ensure that workers of African and Asian origin receive more protection because of higher COVID-19 mobility. What does that mean for such population in countries where data is not collected? However, data alone is not enough. In the world of Rabelais, science sans conscience n'est que ruine de l'âme. Science without conscience is but the ruin of the soul. Data is not enough to shift public perception or tackle discrimination that are manifestation of structural inequalities. Discrimination and racism tend to be presented as inter-individual matters. However, in the same way states are responsible for the implementation of the GCM, states have a key role in tackling discrimination, taking into account relations of power, historical links that planted long ago the seed for dehumanizing narrative about the migration of some people. So far, only half of EU member states have dedicated action plans and strategies to combat racism and ethnic discrimination, and these need to be remedied. The preamble of the Global Compact states that migrants are entitled to the same universal human rights and fundamental freedoms, which must be respected, protected, and fulfilled at all times. For a successful implementation of the GCM and for public perception of migration to change, population in host and transit countries need to be engaged rather than placing the onus solely on migrants. And evidence-based and empathy-led discourse need to go beyond binary depictions of migrants, either at best as means to economic growth or at worst as existential threat, so that fulfilling migrants' rights is not seen as doing them, us, unwarranted favors, but as a matter of fundamental equality. Thank you.
Thank you. I will pass the floor to the ambassador of Azerbaijan, who has for the right to respond. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
In the meantime, Elisa?
Yes, I would like to suggest for Paul, while we're trying to address the technical issues with the ambassador of Azerbaijan's connection, I would suggest for Paul to make some concluding remarks, wrapping the wrapping session, and we will keep on trying to connect the ambassador so that he can comment. Thank you.
Sure. So firstly, thanks very much to everyone who's spoken. I know from the sidebar that there are others who want to come in, but clearly we want to give the ambassador a chance to speak. What I'm not going to do is try and summarize everything that everyone has said, but I think there are some strands that have emerged across which I think will allow us to frame a regional response as is the objective of this conference to feedback to the Global Compact. What has particularly struck me, I suppose, is two or three things. Firstly, that we've heard some very interesting examples from around Europe of how different countries are trying to improve the quality of the data on migration in their own countries. And they're doing that both to improve policymaking, but also, and this is an area where I think there's a lot of interest, because we want to shift public understanding and public attitudes. And looping back to Tim's presentation, I thought it was a very powerful message that stats and data are critical, but they're not on their own enough. And we have to understand psychology and public attitudes if we're going to fight xenophobia, but also if we're going to retain public confidence in migration management systems and borders. And I should say, we've also heard examples, some very interesting examples of how different European countries are building the capacity of data in other countries. So that's the first thing. I think secondly, and perhaps inevitably, given the times that we're living in, we've heard quite a lot about the impact of COVID, C-19 on migration in our region. I've been encouraged and interested to hear how different governments are perhaps relaxing some of the rules and approaches towards migrants to allow them to benefit from health systems. I think, but again, going back to the data point, what seems to me interesting is how COVID and the pandemic has affected public perceptions of migration and immigration in country. We again heard slightly conflicting data on, in some cases, the public attitudes have hardened towards migrants because of the perceived impact on health systems. On the other hand, there have been positive reactions when it comes to healthcare providers. And so I think that will hopefully provide us with a bank of data to try and understand better. I've been thirdly really struck by the what has been a driver of the compact in the first place, and that is the desire to cooperate more internationally. That yes, we are all in our individual countries seeking to manage migration more effectively, but from almost every speaker that I've heard from, we've heard about the need to partner, to cooperate regionally, both within the EU and more broadly, and also to cooperate with third countries. And I think this has been a really important theme of the Global Compact. Those are my main reflections so far. We've had a wealth of information. I'd be interested to hear from IOM colleagues exactly how they're going to capture the all the rich inputs that we've had from the speakers today, and really what are the next steps on this. We have 3 minutes left in this session. I'll hand back to IOM now to see if we fix the technical glitches and whether the ambassador can speak, and whether there's time for any of my panelists to come back. Lisa, over and back to you.
Thank you, Paul. I am trying to see if Ambassador Sadikov, the problems were addressed. If they are addressed, there are, Ambassador has 3 minutes.
I see. Okay, thank you. Do you hear me? Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Madam Moderator. I take this floor to use my right of reply to the representatives of Armenia who have spoken at these and previous sessions. It is truly regretful that while the statement of our Deputy Foreign Minister in the previous session was related to people on the move, including in our region, Armenian representatives have delivered false accusations having nothing to do with today's discussions. Therefore, I am obliged to remind this audience that the act of capitulation, which was signed by the Prime Minister of Armenia on November 10th, had brought to end a 30-year-long occupation by Armenia of the internationally recognized territories of Azerbaijan and has restored historical justice in our region. And the withdrawal of military units of Armenia from the territory of Azerbaijan has already started and has to be concluded by December the 1st. Secondly, Armenia tries to present the current situation in the formerly occupied southwestern regions of Azerbaijan as a humanitarian catastrophe, which is a complete lie utilized for political purposes. The document of November 10th contains a provision on return of all refugees and IDPs to the formerly occupied regions of Azerbaijan, with the participation of the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. And lastly, on the allegations of the use of so-called mercenaries by Azerbaijan. We completely reject these baseless accusations, and the relevant information has already been provided by my country to the UN Working Group on Mercenaries, following its request. And it has to be stressed that the working group indicated in its recent press release that Armenia itself has been involved in the deployment of mercenaries and foreign fighters in the occupied territories of Azerbaijan to take part in the terrorist operations against my country. And we are looking forward to Armenia's relevant reply. Thank you so much, Madam Moderator, and sorry for technical problems. Thank you.
Elisa, over to you. Are you there?
Oh, sorry, yes, I had not unmuted my button. I was thanking the ambassador, taking into consideration the fact that we are rather running a bit late for the closing session. I will respond to your comment, Paul. There will be a report capturing the discussions during these 2 days that will be shared with all participants. So this will be the way of capturing the what has been raised. And with these few words and apologies for those speakers that had expressed an interest to intervene, but due to time constraints, this was not possible. As in other instances, the presentations or the interventions could be shared and could be put into the website. And with these few concluding words, I pass the floor to Mr. Jonathan Prentice, who will be moderating the last session of the closing sessions. With apologies, Jonathan, for the delay, as well as to the honourable speakers that are part of the closing.
Thank you very much, Elisa. My name's Jonathan Prentice. I'm the head of the network secretariat, and without any further ado, and to repeat those apologies, I would like to introduce the first speaker in our closing panel, and we have the great privilege of having with us, I very much hope, Mr. Marco Mendicino, the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship, representing the Government of Canada. Please, sir, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup pour l'opportunité pour cette conversation ce matin. As many of you know, Canada has always been a strong supporter of immigration. There are few in Canada whose family history isn't tied to immigration. In fact, my own parents arrived in Canada from Italy just a little after the Second World War. Canadians understand the importance of immigration to our country, economically, socially, and culturally. We have understood this since before Canada was even a country. Immigration speaks to who we are, who we were, and who we want to be. And that's why it should come as no surprise that Canada was a strong supporter of the GCM during its negotiation. We remain fully committed to it, and even more so, we've enthusiastically accepted the invitation to act as a champion country. There are two main points that we'll be highlighting and advocating strongly for as a GCM champion: the creation of more regular migration pathways and changing the way in which people view migration. First, regular pathways, otherwise known as our normal immigration system. Regular migration pathways create fairer, more transparent opportunities for migrants and allow nations to address their unique needs. These pathways help us to get the workers we need and boost innovation, keep families together, stimulate the economy, and help those fleeing conflict and persecution. This is why Canada recently announced our Immigration Levels Plan for 2021 to 2023, which aims to continue welcoming immigrants at a rate of about 1% of our domestic population of Canada for each year. The Canadian system is nimble, and we continue to explore pilot projects that help us to attract the workers we need and to get them where we need them, which is often outside of our major. And it was at the annual tripartite consultations on resettlement in June of this year that I reaffirmed Canada's ongoing commitment to exploring innovative solutions for refugees. We have increased our efforts to welcome refugees with the skills to hit the ground running through economic channels and not just humanitarian ones. These efforts have had the benefit of not only helping to find a new home for those fleeing conflict and persecution at a time when the need is so great, but also to shatter the notion that refugees are somehow only victims. We know that they are not. They too bring valuable skills and experiences that enrich our country. There were 3 specific actions stemming from our pledge at the Global Refugee Forum in 2019. First, to admit up to 500 refugees as part of the Economic Mobility Pathways Project over the next 2 years. Second, to establish an advisory role for a former refugee to attend international refugee protection meetings with the Canadian delegation. And third, to support the creation of a new global task force on refugee labor mobility. These proposals demonstrate Canada's commitment to refugee protection and the expansion of opportunities for refugees. These are concrete actions that Canada hopes will inspire other countries and partners to broaden their approaches, and we look forward to sharing what we learn through our own experiences. Immigration has brought immeasurable benefits to Canada, and we know that other nations can do the same by creating more regular pathways. Creating pathways also has another benefit. More opportunities for regular migration means that fewer people will be tempted to resort to irregular migration. More pathways are essential to building a world where migration is safer and more orderly. This will particularly be important as border restrictions are lifted after the pandemic. Another area of focus for Canada as champion country is promoting balanced, evidence-based narratives around migration, changing the way people think about migration and newcomers. Public views on migration have a direct impact on border issues like social cohesion and support for diversity. Left unchecked, misinformation and tired negative stereotypes can feed the desire to withdraw and close borders. We need to communicate clearly and openly to push back against racism and xenophobia so that we can continue to share in the prosperity that comes with being an open to opportunity country. Authoritative, factual information about the benefits of migration helps to increase support for migration and to lay the groundwork for the meaningful inclusion and integration of migrants in their host communities. This is of significant benefit to our societies and economies. In Canada, we're trying to ensure a positive narrative through a communications campaign platform called Immigration Matters. This campaign tells the true story of individual immigrants who have contributed to their communities and how we are all benefiting. We are fortunate to have so many success stories to choose from. We see these successes in communities right across our vast nation. Internationally, we are sharing experiences through our work at the Global Forum on Migration and Development to promote balanced, positive public narratives on migration. We are pleased to be leading this work together with the government of Ecuador and municipal representatives in the forum's mayor's mechanism. One of the primary initiatives that we are advancing is an ambitious multi-stakeholder global communications campaign to help shift the narrative and showcase the positive impacts of migration. This campaign is a key action that we can take collectively to help balance migration narratives worldwide, and in doing so, to play an important role in helping to eliminate discrimination against migrants and promote peaceful and inclusive societies for all. We will be encouraging members of the broader international community to join in the campaign by sharing and amplifying positive stories about migration in their own countries and communities. We all have a role to play in shaping this narrative. Local authorities, businesses, civil society, and others all have important voices in this work and can better share the rich and diverse benefits that immigration brings. It is crucial for us to build partnerships as we work together on this issue. It's no coincidence that Canada's greatest eras of economic expansion, from the turn of the 20th century to the post-World War II boom to the impressive growth of the past years, coincided with significant immigration. When our population grows, our economy grows, and all Canadians benefit. Canadians understand that in spite of the challenges of this pandemic, our immigration system is a competitive advantage that drives Canada's success. Opening our doors to new members of the Canadian family has always meant opening our country to prosperity.
Many thanks to the Minister for those closing comments, and many thanks indeed on behalf of the Network on Migration to Canada and its steadfast support to us and to their work in implementing the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration. I would now like immediately to hand the floor to Ms. Berta Nunes, the Secretary of State of Portuguese Communities of the Government of Portugal. Ms. Nunes, the floor is now yours.
Ms. Nunes, if you could please press the request to speak button so you can be admitted to the floor. You are on the floor now. Thank you. Can you please unmute your microphone and switch on your camera?
Okay.
We see and hear you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Prentice. First of all, I would like to address my co-speakers at this closing session, Mr. Stefan Jacquemet and Minister Marco Mendicino. It is an honor to participate at their side, recognizing the International Catholic Migrations Committee's work on migration since the early 50s and the exceptional role played by Canada that with Portugal shares the status of champion country on migrations. It has been an honor for me to take part in this common reflection of the first regional review of the Global Compact for Migration. It was a very fruitful and successful discussion. This review has been a unique opportunity to learn through the experience of member states and other stakeholders, promoting a transparent discussion on international migration. Commitments made in the GCM have been reinforced, and it was a great occasion to share visions on how to address the challenges of today's migration. After this two-day discussion, I would highlight among the different themes addressed, migrants' positive contribution to the development of both countries of origin and destination, the need to reinforce bilateral and multilateral cooperation for upholding human and labor rights of migrants, the need to fulfill the right of migrants to a legal identity and adequate documentation, and to contribute to well-informed public dialogue based on reliable data. These are just some of the main areas identified where further efforts are needed. No country alone can successfully address these needs and many others relevant challenges identified during the 4 roundtables. Thus, Portugal has been advocating for multilateral approaches based on solidarity, human rights, and rules-based international order. Portugal is committed with humanitarian values of protection and solidarity by reinforcing cooperation and participating in specific programs to support integration of refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers. Our history is closely linked to migration, a priority for us. Thereby, as it was already stated, Portugal was one of the first countries to adopt a national implementation plan of Global Compact for Migration. In this context, we see as a priority the building of strong partnerships with countries of origin, transit, and destination, engaging with various stakeholders to that end. In collaboration with IOM, we aim at developing further an adequate framework of labor migration management, especially in contexts where there is high demand for labor. This will also ensure the high protection and integration conditions for migrant workers, while enabling employers to properly fulfill their labor shortage and skill gaps. With this purpose, last September, we co-organized with IOM a very fruitful webinar on labor mobility, and we are currently negotiating bilateral labor migration arrangements with India and Morocco. Unfortunately, COVID-19 exacerbated pre-existing inequalities, prompting economic crisis and job insecurity, unemployment, and social fragilities, thus threatening people on the move who were already most vulnerable before the crisis. In our national context, COVID-19 did not stop our efforts in implementing the GCM. On the contrary, we rearranged our commitments and promptly mobilized to minimize the negative impacts on migrants. Among the measures taken, allow me to underline the grant of temporary residency rights to all immigrants and asylum seekers. Therefore, granting them access until the end of March 2021 to social and health benefits, and grant temporary extensions of documents and visas under the same terms, just to name a few examples. Furthermore, we cannot leave anyone behind in our response and recovery efforts, namely migrants. Our National Recovery and Resilience Plan aims to provide decent housing to migrants and refugees. As a champion country, we look at the two sides of the coin. Portugal is both a country of destination and a country of origin of migrants, and we should take advantage of our experience on working with our communities living abroad. Thereby, we see this role in a broad perspective, to share our experience, to listen to other countries' challenges, and to promote a multi-stakeholder discussion, thus boosting the GCM and contributing to safe, orderly, and regular migration. Looking ahead, we are interested in interacting actively with other member states and stakeholders, aggregating social capital and advocating for inclusive and resilient communities. In this final stretch of the review, let me underline that its added value is not only in and for our region. The lessons learned from this exercise can contribute to the other regional reviews and to consolidate the role of the UN network on migration. Moreover, this regional review substantial discussion will positively feed into the International Migration Review Forum taking place in 2022. Lastly, let me conclude with a note of hope and encouragement for further cooperation. The progress towards the GCM objectives will also accelerate the achievement of sustainable development goals set out in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. It recalls that the main principle in the 2030 Agenda is inclusion, to leave no one behind. Thus, migrants and migration should be considered in all aspects of implementation of this SDG and respective targets. Thank you.
Many thanks, Ms. Nunes, for the intervention on behalf of the Government of Portugal, and I would like to repeat what I said to the Minister from the Government of Canada and give my heartfelt thanks on behalf of the network to the Government of Portugal for your government support for our efforts and for the moving forward with the GCM agenda generally. We really do appreciate it profoundly. I would now like to turn to our third speaker on the closing panel, Mr. Stéphane Jacquemet, the Director of Policy for the International Catholic Migration Committee. Mr. Jacquemet, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jonathan. Can you hear me? I'm not sure you can see me.
Cannot see you, but can hear you loud and clear.
So I will go ahead without the camera because I know that there was a problem.
Wonderful.
So thanks a lot, Jonathan, for inviting me. Indeed, a great honor to be on this panel along with the Portuguese Secretary of State, the Canadian Immigration Minister, my colleague Camilla from the UN Major Group on Children and Youth, and indeed yourself, Jonathan, as well.
Stéphane, I think we may be losing you.
Yes? Yeah?
Yeah, please.
And indeed, what we can realistically achieve within the coming year. And I have chosen three takeaways, three absolute priorities given all the destructions, lives, livelihoods, jobs, hopes, and human tragedies brought by the COVID-19 crisis. All three priorities predate the pandemic, but have been made even more compelling by the crisis. So the first priority, no surprise, is access to services. Migrants, regardless of their status, and here I insist, regardless of their status, should have access to services, in particular health services, and I don't need to explain why, education. I find it extremely cruel at this very depressing moment to deprive migrant children from schooling, and social services, in particular, all the network support helping migrants to navigate the bureaucratic steps in the country where they reside. As importantly, migrants must know they will not be arrested or deported if they go to hospital, attend school, or activate social protection mechanism. The so-called firewalls, and I know that many governments are uneasy with this expression, are in fact not so complicated to implement and must not be a taboo, since they ensure basic human dignity, they restore the trust between migrants and the authorities, something essential if we want migrants to cooperate with the authorities, and a must in terms of security. And the firewalls are just basic solidarity at a time when solidarity is the definer of a caring and resilient society. The second priority is creating and expanding regular pathway. And here I'm very happy that both my co-speakers from Portugal and Canada have mentioned in a very positive light regular pathway, but I think it should expand to many more countries. We should never lose sight of the fact that the Global Compact in its very title is about safe, orderly, and regular migration. So how can we then do justice to the title if regular pathways are not genuinely created and promoted, and the vast majority of would-be migrants cannot access them? It is also important to keep in mind that the Global Compact negotiations were launched by the September 2016 UN New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants, which was itself, to a large extent, the product of the 2015 situation in Europe, when more than 1 million refugees and migrants arrived in Europe. An emergency partly provoked by the lack of regular pathways, already a reality at that time. Now, if we take the various migration packages in the UNIC region, whether at sub-regional or national levels, we see that UN member states, most of the time, do refer to many different areas: migrant rights, access to asylum, border management, returns, international cooperation, financial support to countries of origin, etc., except regular pathways. We must move on. The pandemic has created massive unemployment, and it may not be the best of times to create opportunities when so much just needs to be fixed and repaired. At the same time, we will only get out of economic recession through bold moves, and a number of governments are proven to be bold these days, massive financial investments, but also investing in migrant workers and genuinely involving trade unions, employers, and local authorities. Regular pathways are about work permits and visa, but it is broader. It is education. It is also making sure families are not separated or are quickly reunited. My third and final point is about detention. It could have been border management, decent work, or returns. I have chosen detention because of its importance, but also because it is the one issue where we have seen many positive government initiatives in the past months, aiming at either releasing detained migrants, often in relatively large numbers, or not detaining them. We have now a solid body of best practices, many predating the pandemic, others as a principled response to the health crisis. On these fully tested best practices, we can build an environment where alternatives to detention systematically prevail. Alternatives to immigration detention work, as amply demonstrated by recent pilot projects, which involve a multi-stakeholder approach, and in countries that do not resort or only exceptionally to immigration detention. Let's invest in them while not forgetting that child detention is never an option. It is against international standards, it is unacceptable and unjustifiable. Such a stance is legal, ethical, common sense, and in everyone's interest. Nevertheless, child detention continues. And as my colleague Michel Levoy mentioned during the opening session, it may even receive a new impetus with the new EU Pact on Migration, and that is wrong. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and thank you also for distilling down your take on 2 days of very rich conversations into a number of very concrete action points. That's extremely helpful for all of us and for developing strategies for moving forward. And now the privilege of the last presenter of the 2-day regional review goes to Ms. Camilla Ioli, the Europe focal point for the UN Major Group on Children and Youth. Please, ma'am, the floor is yours.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Jonathan, for the floor, and esteemed guests for your intervention. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me thank you first for an enriching discussion over the past 2 days and for having involved youth voices in such a key process at the European and international level. It is an honor for us to engage with such distinguished panelists. With the 2030 Agenda commitment on leaving no one behind, it is impossible to ignore the issue of migration. For this reason, as UNMGCY, we strongly support the GCM and its implementation at all levels. With 1/3 of people on the move under the age of 30, it is crucial to include the youth perspective. We conducted an extensive consultation of youth-led and youth-serving organizations representing over 4,600 youth in Europe to gather young people's perspective and action on the implementation of the GCM. We have policy briefs collecting all the results, and we will circulate them. One of the key learnings from our consultation is that youth are leading and are involved in high numbers of innovative projects contributing to the implementation of the GCM. For instance, youth projects are helping migrants integrate economically and socially, including through skill-building programs, education, and employability support, as well as intensive language training matching their chosen areas of work and study. Young people are also contributing to migrants' protection and helping them access services, with particular attention to more vulnerable groups, including LGBTQI+ or younger adolescents. For example, an organization in Germany provides in-demand vocational training, consultancy on the importance of legal residence and identity stabilization support. Young people are also fighting discrimination and xenophobia by building relationships between migrants and local community leaders, by creating areas of discussion and integration, such as workshops in school or sport activities. For example, an organization in Portugal helps migrant youth build stronger relationships with local communities by providing them with facilitators who help them navigate existing bureaucratic channels and providing access to local support systems, such as enrollment in local school. Our consultation also made it really clear that current implementation of the GCM is not enough. In particular, we call for an emphasis on the following. First, we ask to prioritize the streamlining recognition of foreign qualification and certifications. Inflexible and burdensome requirements on documentation that do not take into account the situation of home countries mean that many migrants are unable to meet the requirements and thus are not able to work in their professions and contribute their skills to their new communities. Young migrants bring with them incredible talent and potential, so let's stop wasting it. Second, we call on governments to increase funding for organizations and projects linked to GCM implementation, including those led by youth. For instance, social workers and legal support, language classes, and skilling programs. Important, as was already mentioned by other speakers, we need to ensure that no child or young person, regardless of their migratory status, is missing out on their education. This is still not the case. Youth migrants at the borders of Europe and in European countries are lacking access to school. Third, we are asking for an end to child detention once and for all, in line with the rights of the child and their best interest. We are too far from the commitment that was made in the compact. As you all know, the negative impact on a child's health, psychosocial, and academic development is extremely profound and long-lasting. If no progress is made on these issues and the GCM overall, not only Europe will be missing out on migrants' contribution to its society and economy, but we will all face a long-term economic and political challenges. We know that COVID-19 pandemic has made it hard for everyone to focus on issues beside the health crisis. But the pandemic accelerated inequalities and negatively impacted migrants much more than many other groups, and with long-lasting consequences. This makes the GCM implementation more and not less urgent. The 2022 deadline for the global review is coming up, and we stress the urgency of the state of youth migration. We call on governments and all relevant stakeholders to prioritize increasing their efforts in implementing the GCM, including with youth priorities in mind. Young people are mobilizing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Camilla. I really can't think of a better or more powerful way to end this first regional review, and you can certainly be assured of the network's commitment to providing youth with meaningful platforms for engagement moving forward. So with that, we come to an end, and I would like to simply make, and I promise quick points. Everything that is being discussed, every submission that has been put through in advance of this meeting is available on the network website. We commend that to you. We will be sending out a newsletter to our subscription lists with the key findings and submissions that have come from this discussion. Secondly, we will be sharing lessons learned from this first regional review with colleagues supporting the organization of reviews in the other regions on the UN footprint. And we will be seeking feedback as to how we can strengthen these gatherings moving forward, recognizing the strange environment, the strange days in which we're operating, but how we can strengthen these consultations to make them as dynamic and meaningful as possible. Thirdly, dynamic is a word that has been mentioned often over the past few days. We are determined in the network to ensure that we don't just stop here with discussions regarding implementation of the GCM in the UNECE region until the global review in 2022 that Camilla and others just referenced, but we will be looking for ways to further the ideas and the discourse and the proposals that have been generated by this particular review to further stimulate conversation between now and the global review. And my final words, and the final words of this regional review, are to thank you all. Thank you all after a long, hard, arduous year for helping to make this really a first and I think a very positive step forward in fulfilling the commitments to follow up and review for the Global Compact for safe, orderly and regular migration. My thanks, be well, be safe, and we will be in touch. Bye-bye.